Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. My name is Dan. I'm a software engineer. I work for a company called HS2 Solutions. I actually used to work for a company called Lunametrics, and then we were bought by HS2 Solutions. So now they're my employer. We have an office here in Pittsburgh. I work out of the South Side. And then we also have offices in like Chicago and Colorado and San Francisco. I don't know why I treated Colorado as a city, but whatever. And then we have technically an office in Berlin, but it's like 2 people, you know, that kind of thing. And as a company, we do all sorts of services running the gamut from digital marketing strategy, which is all about how do I make my application, website, whatever it might be, more visible to the web. So if you've heard of search engine optimization or search engine marketing, you know, Google Ads, that kind of thing, we do that. I've come from that world a little bit. And we also do development. So, you know, and that's everything from like highly custom engineering projects all the way up to, you know, we're going to help you improve your Adobe AEM experience site. So you're probably thinking that today we're going to talk a little bit about Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager and maybe some GA and GTM foot guns, possibly some neat things to measure. And we're kind of going to do that, but we're also going to talk a little bit about belief systems and about empathy and about how all problems are ultimately people problems. And okay, all these things, and then also about me, a lot about me. Yeah, we're at slide 6 of 231 slides, and I'm going to devote the first half exclusively to my personal history. So we'll start with the early years, which would be right when I got out of college. There wasn't really a whole lot going on in terms of the job market scene, so I was a graduate of the Advertising and Public Relations School at Penn State University. Wanted to stand out a little bit, so I decided to teach myself how to run social media advertising. At the time, like the Facebook ads platform was, you know, nascent. There wasn't really a whole lot going on in terms of that advertising vertical. So if you could figure out how to do it, you could maybe stand out a bit. And so I started doing that. I got a job working at this company, Lunametrics. I wanted to learn more about how those ads were actually impacting important business metrics. So then I started teaching myself how to use Google Analytics. Fortunately, the company that I mentioned, Lunametrics, had a strong specialty in GA, so I got to learn a lot there. And then ultimately, I moved my way over into the programming world. You know, once I figured out how to measure the stuff, I wanted to know how the measurement actually worked. So let's figure out how those hits are getting sent, how are they actually processed by the server, what does that application stack look like, how does all this fun stuff get put together, which kind of brings me to where I am today. But throughout all my time working in these different fields, I've spent most of it straddling this sort of development and marketing world, sort of like a foot in each of the 2 worlds. And it is often like a super tense place to be. I've noticed that more often than not, you go to a company and the developers hate the marketers and the marketers hate the developers. And ne'er the 2 e'er shall meet. So here's what I've kind of learned about that. As part of my day job, I often work as a consultant. I go to the company. I'm there to help them ostensibly with their Google Analytics, but really what I'm there to do is sort of like build bridges between these 2 disparate departments and teach them how to work together, how to speak a single language, and how to make these tools effective. I'm going to drive this point home a lot today, but I really, really firmly believe that it doesn't matter what you measure, it doesn't matter how good your analytics tools are, if you haven't come down or come together on a strategy to actually use that data to make the decisions that you need to make, it's just worthless. You can only get so far. And the reason is that at the end of every chain of deep technical knowledge, you know, sometimes super short chains, sometimes super long chains, it's just this weird inscrutable black box, right? No matter how much you know about something, you know, maybe it's a short chain. I'm going to show people my product. They're going to buy it. Really simple, like 2 steps there. Sometimes it's a really long chain, right? Sometimes it's like, all right, I can tell you everything that happens from the moment you click a link on your browser to when this button starts flashing and all the steps in between. I can give you that entire rundown. But no matter how long these are, you're always going to end up at a point at which you move from knowledge to faith, right? And that makes sense because, you know, not everyone can know everything. Sometimes that's like, all right, users are going to abandon our site if it takes longer than 2 seconds to load. This is a phrase I hear repeated over and over and over again. A lot of very performance-conscious devs are saying, like, all right, we need to, move to just inline and critical CSS. We need to take all these radical steps in order to improve the page load time of our site. But when you try and like pick at that and you ask them like, okay, what do you mean by page load time? Do you mean like when the window.load event fires? Or do you mean when your site is interactive? Or do you mean just when the DOM's ready, right? You might have a belief like Google will rank our site lower if it's slow to load. This is another belief, right? Like, sure, Google's come out. They've said before, like, yes, we look at page speed as one of the factors in how we rank our sites. But often I'll deal with teams where this is the sole justification for radical changes to their site structure. And at the end of it, no one really knows exactly what's going on inside of the way that, the search engine is ranking those pages. Our users love this feature, will love this feature, have always loved this feature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? They're these belief systems. And they're totally natural. It's really expensive to learn stuff, but it's really cheap to generalize. And it's also simultaneously expensive to be wrong. And these two pieces of information can lead to factionalization inside of an organization. Because you've got this belief, our site needs to be fast, or we need to have this really important marketing technology deployed on our site. You can only go so far with that understanding. So at some point you reach faith, right? You're saying like, all right, this has to be true because I believe it to be true. But if that's in conflict with another idea inside your organization, you end up with a faction. And then a faction can lead to a holy war, right? And then you can end up with statements like these flying around on private Slack channels. Like, oh, marketing is asking us to add this, yet another stupid technology to our site. Ugh. Oh, the developers are clueless. They mess everything up. They don't do anything right. Like, these are real things that I hear as a consultant all the time. And ultimately, they boil down to, we do the hard work and they're wasting time. That's kind of what these sentiments end up meaning. And again, this can lead to these two factions starting to arm themselves against one another. Dev teams can start to work really hard to introduce processes that cut marketing out of decision making. Right? Marketing teams can choose to install or use technologies that try and cut IT out of decision making, both of which are bad and not good for the organization as a whole. They're not good for your mental sanity. They're not good for anybody, right? But all right, hang on a second. We're getting way off track, right? This is supposed to be a talk about analytics. It's supposed to be about GTM, GA. Let's back it up, okay? Let me introduce you to some of the leaders in my own personal belief system, the bishops in my church, right? So these are GA and GTM. So these are tools that are made by Google. They're designed for marketers, and they have really great features. For example, they're wildly customizable. They offer some awesome tools for segmenting data, reporting on that data. They have great user interfaces. They have really good integrations with other Google tools, and so on and so on. Best feature, free 99, right? Doesn't cost a dime. You can sign up. You can deploy these tools on your website, and you pretty much don't have to pay. Okay, there's one little asterisk there. So for the Google Analytics product, there is a limit on how many hits you can send per month, but it's pretty permissive. 10 million hits is usually quite a lot for most use cases. And these are essentially just tools for measuring and reporting on the behavior of visitors to our website. And you might be saying like, oh, well, okay, I like server logs, or I like this other particular tool that I've used and had experience with. I'm not really here to tell you which tool is the best one for the job. These are just the tools that I've had the most experience with. But I also feel really strongly that for the most part, when a tool doesn't work, it's actually the organization that's not working. The problem is a people problem. But tools are the easiest thing to replace. So everyone says, oh, it's not that Google Analytics, or it's not that our organization sucks, it's that Google Analytics sucks and we need to switch it for Adobe Analytics, or vice versa, right? Hike your own hike. Whatever works best for you, use that tool. That's the best tool you've got, right? The most important thing is using those tools to measure and improve, and measure and improvement involves more than just collecting data, right? All right, so let's get back to the tools. Let's talk about the Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager code and how we actually get those on our site, right? A couple easy steps. First, we have to install a snippet. How you do this is probably going to depend on how your application is structured. If you want, you can just stick it into whatever base HTML you're loading on your site. So if you're using a single-page application, you probably just got that one index.html file. You just ship that. You can just stick that in there if you really want to. And this is what the snippet looks like for just Google Analytics, right? So you're just going to get the features that Google Analytics provides. page view tracking, event tracking, and a whole bunch of other neat stuff, which we'll talk about in a minute. Quick note for the really, performance and really budget conscious. These snippets are all async by default. So Google's obviously aware of how much load they're putting on just the internet in general by creating these tools. They want to make it as easy for your users to download them, use them. They want to make it as easy for their users to deploy them. So they load asynchronously, meaning they're on a separate thread. They're not going to get in the way of rendering the UI. They're going to wait until everything is done, and then they'll execute the JavaScript payload that they download. GA is just 14 kilobytes gzipped. GTM, a little bigger, but that's mostly because GTM is a little more encompassing than Google Analytics. So GA, that's our tool that measures our page views, measures our site behavior. But Google Tag Manager is a tool for using a tool. It's a tool for deploying Google Analytics. And it gives us a WYSIWYG interface for deploying tools like Google Analytics, but also other tools. So, as your organization grows, you might have a marketing department, and that marketing department might say, hey, we would like to start running LinkedIn advertising. And LinkedIn advertising offers this really neat conversion pixel, and we can use it to measure when, after someone clicks on an ad on LinkedIn, they convert on some important goal on our website, whatever that might be. What Google Tag Manager allows you to do is deliver that stuff without actually making changes to your site. You can deliver that stuff through Google Tag Manager. You go in, you make the change, you add the tag, whatever it is, and it just publishes, goes right out to your site. You can even put in custom code and custom functionality. So if you want to write your own JavaScript, you can do that. So can your marketing team, which, right, it's a code injector. So that's really what it is. Okay, it's a fancy, nice UI code injector, which may make you start to sweat if you're worried about things like, oh God, what are we going to let the marketing department just put code on our site, right? And of course, that's one of those thoughts that falls back into that, here, this is this department upset with this other department. But don't worry, because this gun has a safety, right? So Google Tag Manager comes with the ability to disable that custom code entirely. So out of the box, if you wanted to, put a Bitcoin miner on your site via GTM, somebody could do that entirely outside of the IT department. However, you can disable that custom code entirely. So you could say only allow users to push through vendor tags. You can also say we want to use two-factor authorization anytime somebody's trying to put a custom JavaScript change into our container. They want to add custom HTML. They want to add a custom JavaScript variable. These are both things specific to GTM. You can essentially say, well, they're going to need a second form of authorization. They're going to need to have either a code shipped via SMS or via the Authenticator app. And there's also some size limits on the container, right? There's also lots of benefits to this. So I like to stress, yes, it does move things outside of the purview of the typical IT release cycle, but that can actually be really helpful, right? Because it means that there's a lot of tickets that might otherwise be sitting on the plates of your developers that can be shunted off to the marketing team. If they're just things like putting out configuration changes or adding an event tag, something really simple, chances are somebody in another department can take care of it. It also is great because it means that we're separating those concerns from our normal website code for the most part. We don't have to hard code stuff in like we used to have to do. We also have more flexibility with our vendors. And of course, like I mentioned before, it's a really great tool, but it really relies on good governance, right? So you need to sort of weigh all these factors and come up with a process that works for your organization where you're saying, all right, we want the flexibility, we want the speed, but we also want to make sure that we're doing things safely and we're not going to have somebody accidentally drop some JavaScript that overwrites an important global or somehow breaks our site in another meaningful way. All right, which of course that means getting people on the same page, which just brings us right back around to our people problems because we can't seem to avoid them, but we'll get back to that again in a little later, okay? So once we have the snippet on our page, then we just need to run whatever the desired command is. So if we're using the old school, just GA, no GTM involved, it looks like this. It's really simple. So that gtag snippet, that's going to declare this gtag global. And this gtag global expects one or two different commands, like config here. Here you'd plug in a tracking ID from the Google Analytics interface. That's it, and it'll automatically fire a page view. So there you go. You call that command, page view gets sent off to your account. The page is, when the page view fires, it's just going to look at whatever the current page path is. It's going to assign that page view to that page. It'll start a session. It'll start a new user if there isn't one. All that fun stuff just with that one hit. You can also send events. We'll take a look at some good ideas for events a little bit later. But syntax, pretty similar. We say gtag event. We declare an action, which is a thing specific to Google Analytics. And then we can additionally add in information about a category and a label and a value. The category is required, the action is required, these other ones are optional. We'll take a look at some good examples of those, as I said, later on in the slides. If you're using GTM, things are a little different. So I mentioned GTM really is just a tool to ship other tools. And as a result, GTM needs to create a sort of interface where we can communicate with it, and then it can, in turn, communicate with the tools that we've set up inside of the UI. And that interface is called the data layer. It's global. It acts kind of like an array. It actually starts its life as an array, but then when GTM loads, it'll overwrite the push method with some magic. So don't do anything fancy with like shifting or anything outside of the normal just push call. And inside of this, or when we call data layer push, we pass it an object. GTM requires that object has a key named event. We can put in any arbitrary string we'd like for that event key. And that's all that we have to do in order to tell it that something has happened. We can add in additional data, which we'll see later, which we can then map to fields on hits inside of the GTM UI. If we have time at the end of the talk, we'll go through setting this up inside of the GTM interface so you can actually see it in action. But for now, just remember, we need that event key, and we use data layer push in order to let it know something occurred. Once a push occurs, GTM is going to look at that event key. It'll look for something called a trigger that matches that name. So in our example, we had page view. It's going to find any tags that are tied to that trigger, and then it'll fire them. And again, a little confusing, but we'll take a look at an example if we have time at the end of the day. It also brings in a lot of built-ins, so stuff that allows you to do more advanced tracking without adding more code to your site. So it'll do things like automatically listen for clicks on elements, and then it'll grab that element and then make it available via a bunch of different variables so that we can do things like, let's take the text out of the element that the user clicked on, or other fun stuff. Also form submissions, and even an error listener. So if you've ever used a tool like a Rollbar or Sentry or any number of JavaScript error catching tools, well, you could replace that if you wanted with GTM and this error listener. You could track that inside of Google Analytics. We'll even take a look at what that might look like a little later. The data that we add as those keys, so event, and then we can add additional keys in that object, they're just going to get mapped to something called variables. You have to set that up in the UI. They very cleverly named those variables variables. And then again, those variables, they're going to get plugged into tag fields or inside of those trigger fields to send along the data. So once you've set that up, you've created your data layer push, you've created your tag, you've created your trigger, you've created your variables. Then you just push this big red publish button, and it's instantly delivered to your live site. Which, again, might make you a little nervous if you're used to a little bit more of a stricter governance policy about what we let go on our site, how we QA everything, how we check everything. And it should, because again, GTM can be a weapon. It can be something that's used explicitly to say, no, we don't need you, get out of the way, we're going to do things our way, in a confrontational way, in a way that doesn't provide value to the company, doesn't provide value to people, and is specifically to circumvent that normal process. And again, it doesn't help that a lot of the marketing around tools like GTM sort of centers around that message of, cut out IT, we don't need them. The thing is that it actually really serves as a better bridge. GTM is great because it finally offers a place for all of the stakeholders to have sort of a common language, to talk about like, hey, I'm in marketing and I understand how these measurement tools work intimately. And you're a developer and you understand how our website works intimately. And now we have a very clear boundary where we can say like, I just need you to know this one thing. I need you to know data layer push, that's it. If you know that, then I'm in business, right? And I can take care of the rest. I can wire up the tag, I can set up the trigger, everything like that. I'm the one who's going to be looking at the data, so I'm going to know if something's wrong, and I'm going to be the one who cares about it, right? So we're separating those concerns and giving them to the appropriate stakeholders. And it can also serve as a place for us to talk about, like, why are we measuring stuff in the first place? Again, as a consultant, like lots of times, I'll roll in, work with a client, and it's like, oh, you've got 600 different things in here. What are you doing with any of them? They're like, oh, well, we just thought it'd be good to have, or, Jim saw this blog post one day and put it on the site or whatever. There's no purpose for it, and there's no meaningful action taken with it. Again, it just breaks my heart because it means that we've got so much potential squandered on what typically ends up being sort of like navel-gazy stuff. It's just, oh, we got 600 page views on this blog post. but I can't do anything about it because I can't make any changes to the website because I don't agree with development on anything leading up to this point, right? And again, it really can help everybody because it just offloads complexity the right way. And your mileage may vary, right? So then, once we've got those things set up, we get data, right? Specifically, we get Google Analytics data, which is organized thusly. And I'll make these slides available afterwards, so if you want to pick through this, you can. We've got users. Users in turn have sessions. Sessions in turn have hits. And those hits have dimensions, and all this data is then summed up into metrics, right? That's a real quick high-level snapshot of the way that GA views the world. A user just equals one unique identifying cookie. So whenever a GA hit fires, it's going to attempt to set a cookie called _GA. Inside of it, it's going to generate a random value if there isn't already a GA cookie present. It's going to store that. Every hit gets that cookie sent along. That's going to represent our user. Important thing to note about this is that it's a cookie, right? So it's browser specific. If you've got a device with 3 different browsers and you visit the same site with all 3 of them, you're going to have 3 users, right? Because each browser is going to get a different cookie. Those users have sessions. Those sessions are it's a little murky what the definition is if you're just getting started or looking in the interface, but it is important. And a session in the Google universe is defined as a period of time between the first hit of the session and then whenever there's 30 minutes without an additional hit. So if I come to your website and every 29 minutes I send a page view, then my session's going to keep going, hours and hours and hours. But after 30 minutes have expired, GA says, all right, we haven't seen a hit in 30 minutes, session's over, let's wrap this up, and we'll do a little more processing in order to figure out stuff like where the user exited the site, that sort of thing. You can change these things. So the session limit you can change inside of the settings. And the way that you define users, you're allowed to provide whatever identifier you'd like. You don't have to use their default GA cookie. And you can do some cooler stuff with that too as well. And then a hit's great because hit's just a hit, right? There's 2 types. There's page views and events. There's a few other types, but they're not really important. The only one you really are going to care about are page views and events. And now that we've got data, we can use this to collect evidence and make predictions and figure out, all right, users seem to like this particular content, or they really like this feature, or whatever it might be. And you get a lot right out of the box. So right out of the box, you can see where someone came from, what they did on your site, how certain things performed. That's right, we can measure performance. So right out of the box, you get what are called the page speed timings reports. And what do those look like? Hang on 1 second. So these are reports that are inside the Google interface that will show us data on how long it takes for our page to load. And I'm just hiding my screen because I want to make sure that I don't have anything sensitive open when I switch over to this. So we're going to pop into the Google Analytics demo account. So Google Analytics offers a free to access account where they've set up most of the features of the tool. And it's using data that they collect from their shop site. So it's basically like where employees go, buy t-shirts, that kind of thing. And on that website, they're gathering data about the purchases that are made, where users come from, all that kind of fun stuff. And we can take a look at it as soon as I get my internet hooked up. All right, cool. So let me just make sure I got that selected. So we're going to take a look at these reports now. We'll take a look at a few of the performance-oriented reports. And then we'll talk about how we can customize these things further. If I can get the interface to load. There we go. Okay. So let's pop this open. And welcome to the Google Analytics interface. There's a hive of activity. By default, you enter in the interface, you're greeted with this nice fancy dashboard, lots of cool little widgets, all that sort of fun stuff. We're not going to worry too much about that for now. The reports that we're interested in are the performance reports. And so Google Analytics breaks its reports into these 3 different groupings. They have audience reports, which are all about like who came to our website and what did they look like. They have behavior reports, what did they do on the site. And then they have conversion-based reports, which are stuff like if we set up a special feature called goals, how many of those were achieved by how many users from how many different source mediums, etc. and e-commerce. So if we sell stuff, we can pass along information about transactions and then report on it here. All super handy stuff. The performance-based stuff that we're going to look at lives inside of the behavior reports on the left-hand nav. Oh, sorry, I just realized this is like, there we go, borrowers sized. And specifically, we're going to look inside the site speed reports. So there's this report called page timings. And the default Google Analytics snippet is going to do a really nice thing for you. Every 1% of users that come to your website, it's going to gather data on how long it took for your site to load. So it gets this from the performance API that the browser exposes that anybody can take advantage of. And they'll gather all sorts of useful timing data, store it in here for you. You can browse it, take a look at it, and use it to make some decisions. The one that we're looking at right now is the average page load time. It's just the mean time that it took for the page load event to fire for any given page on your site. And if we scroll down, we've got this really nice comparison view built right in. We can look at this and see, like, right off the bat, here are some pages that are maybe performing a little better. Here are some pages that are maybe performing a little worse, right? Like the store HTML page seems to take twice as long to load as the average page on our site. At the top, we can also get some more specific timings. So if we want to get technical timings about our site's performance, those are available as well. So we can see things like domain lookup time, if that's important to you, or time spent redirecting. We can get all that inside of this report. We can get DOM timings, and we can even change the way that it reports on them for us. So by default, we get this chart and then this table underneath of it. But instead, we can ask it to show us a distribution, right? So it's a mean. Means aren't super great because if you've got an outlier either direction, it can really skew that mean, and we end up with a number that's not representative. So I always like to take a look at the distribution here because I'm going to get a much better idea of what the actual amount of time it takes for a page to load might look like. And so here you can see we can expand it, look at all this stuff. Super great, except there's one teeny tiny problem. Does anyone want to take a guess what that problem is? Can anyone see something really weird on this page? What's odd? Got our page load time, got our distribution, fine. This UI is a little clunky, but we'll give them a pass, right? It's free, so can't be too mad. Got our page views, and then we have this thing, page load sample. What is that? Does anyone want to take a guess what page load sample is? Any guesses? Reach back to Stats 101. What's sampling? Right, exactly. Thank you, Brandon. It is a subset of our total page views. I don't have a t-shirt to give you, unfortunately. But, so the data that we're seeing in these reports is actually based off of just 700 hits out of the 76,000 that we had on our website. So if our numbers are, if we're looking at a page that didn't get a lot of traffic, we might only have one or two page load samples for that page, and it could be like way off. We could end up with something saying, that there's a, let's say, 60-second page load time for a given piece of content on our site, and go down a huge rabbit hole trying to figure out why that is and how we can improve it. When in reality, it's just that the page load timing was from one user in Siberia with a potato for a modem, and it ended up taking a long time for that to get delivered, right? So if we sort this by, we look at our page load time, we can see a couple examples of this here. Right, so we're going to sort this in descending order. So here's one that says it took 51.96 seconds to hit window load. That seems a little excessive for any site, right? Especially a site owned and operated by the good folks at Google. And if we open up that page itself, we can even see like it's a 404 page and it really doesn't take all that long to load, which means that our data is being poisoned because we've only got one or two samples for that particular page, and they took way longer than average. Another thing that can kind of mess with the data, we may really only care about performance in particular geographies. So a lot of companies that I've worked with, they only sell stuff in the United States or US and Canada. They're not worldwide. And when they report on their data, they're getting data from everywhere, from all over the world. Your website typically doesn't care. So it's going to say, oh, somebody asked for this page, let's serve it to them. And of course, then analytics is going to load, it's going to track that, it's going to fire that page view. And so you're going to end up with like, our average page load time for our entire site includes the average page load for hits from Italy, where it took an average of 26 seconds to load, right? Good news is you can filter that data out. It's one of the nicer features of GA. So if you don't want it, you don't have to keep it. And the other thing you can do is you can roll your own. So let's jump back to the presentation here. I'm gonna have to jump forward a little bit. You can also roll your own. And I've got a really nice blog post about how to do just that. Where basically we use the exact same API that Google Analytics is using in order to, oh my goodness, we've been through a lot, in order to gather that data. And there we go. Right. There's also the speed suggestions report, which is nice because it runs. Are y'all familiar with what's it called? Lighthouse, Google's like built-in Chrome profiler, and yeah. So it'll actually run a lot of those same tests for you on your site content. You have to reach a certain threshold for it to do it automatically in terms of hits. But even if you don't reach that threshold, you can just kick it off right there. It's built right into the interface, super easy to use, and it'll give us a score for each of the pages on our site. So we can quickly and easily see like, hey, there are certain pages on our site that perform better or worse than other pages on our site. And it also will, like I said, link us straight to a site speed optimization report, which is going to list out a whole bunch of suggestions on how we can make it better, right? We're not taking advantage of browser caching, we're not, et cetera, et cetera. It'll tell us what those potential optimizations might be, and we can see it for mobile, we can see it for desktop, and it'll list everything down here for us. All right. We also, if we want to make our site even better, we want to go further than just measuring the performance of how long pages take to load and how we can improve that. We can look at stuff like bounce reporting. So this moves a little bit outside of the strictly, all right, how long does this bundle take to download on the user's browser sort of question. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the content on our site, and we're going to see, let's see, of all the pages on our site, what are the pages that users are most likely to immediately exit the site when they reach? This can be really important, especially if that particular page is designed to be a conversion page. It's supposed to be the page where the user signs up for our service or gives us their email and subscribes to something. We can view this metric inside the behavior site content landing pages report called bounce rate. And in Google Analytics parlance, what a bounce is you have a session that starts, there's a hit that gets sent in, session starts, and then no other hits. That's it. So it's important to be aware of that definition, because that means that if I'm a user and I go to your website and you have a 45-minute TED Talk, and I watch the entire TED Talk, and then I browse to another page on your site, what's going to happen? Any guesses? New session, right? So you're going to end up with 2 sessions. It's going to mess with your reporting, might mess with your attribution, all sorts of stuff that you don't want. Good news is, again, you can configure that. That's that session timeout setting. So if you do have users that spend longer on your site, but they don't tend to emit a lot of hits, you can send that up. You can also set up just a timer to say like, all right, we're going to just check in. We'll send a hit every 15 seconds or something like that. We'll send an event. Now the bounce rate as a metric can be useful. We can just kind of eyeball it looking through this particular report. We can sort by it quickly and easily. Just click this little button. It's going to give us that sorted. But what's immediately unhelpful about this report? Sorted by our bounce rate, right? Get that guy here. What can I do with this information? What are we seeing? Sure, they're all tied for worst. But what else do we maybe notice about these? I wish this had does this have a laser on it? It does have a laser on it. Ah, this changes everything. Okay. So what else do we notice about maybe these numbers here?
You're only getting visited once.
Right. These are pages on our site that were only visited by one person and they left. Who cares, right? Like we have pages on our site that get way more traffic. If we go back to looking at this table organized by sessions, we can see we have many pages that get well over 100 sessions that start on those pages. So the good news is we can make this report actionable by changing the way that these are sorted. There's this little drop down up here. We can select weighted sort. And what that'll do is that'll change the way that this metric is calculated. So instead of just being flat percentage and descending order, it's going to take the percentage and multiply it by the number of sessions in order to get a weighted metric. And then it'll sort accordingly. So now when we look at this report, we're going to see pages that both receive a lot of traffic and have an exceptionally high bounce rate. Right? So this YouTube redesign page might be one that's worth having our UI, UX team take a second look at, because we get a lot of traffic there. There's probably something we want the user to do other than leave. Let's figure out how we can fix that. Conversely, if you've got a lot of like blog content or informational content on your site, it is not at all unusual to see this in excess of like 90%. And that, if you think about it, makes sense. At first it can be a little alarming, but like if I'm a user and I search for, Google Analytics customizations, and I land on my website and I read that page, I probably only need the information on that page. I probably don't care about what else is on the website, right? So I'm going to take off. I got what I wanted. I'm done. There's a chance maybe I'll see a related link. I might stick around for that. But often that's not only what you expect, but that's also totally fine, right? That's maybe not the whole point of that content. Where we really want to be concerned is pages where we expect further user interaction. They enter the site and they leave. How can we fix those? Here's how we find them. Now we have to move on to fixing them. And again, this all ties back into we need to have a good working relationship between our different moving pieces in order to make that functionally possible. Because if I'm a marketer and I see this data and I say this page sucks, if the devs won't do what I ask them to do, nothing's going to happen, right? And vice versa, if I'm a dev and I say, hey, here are these metrics, we need to make some changes, the marketing department's not going to help, right? So it's really important to remember that communication is the linchpin of this whole thing. If you want to be really crazy awesome, you can tag your features, right? So we're going to take a look at some more examples of ways that we can customize what we're tracking. But come up with a schema, a strategy, a convention that means that when you launch a new feature, you're tracking automatically how many users actually use it, how many times they use it, who are our power users, who are users that haven't seen it yet. There's all sorts of amazing integrations you can take advantage of just by doing that. So you can target those users with advertising via this tool if you need to or if you want to. But you can also just get a better idea of where you're whether or not what you're spending your time on is valuable. At a company I worked with that felt like their users just came back to the site all the time, they loved them, they'd buy like 2 or 3 times a year, we'd absolutely see these folks all the time. We got into their data, did some analysis on their customer base, and it's like, oh, actually, 94% of your users never come back again, never buy again. You never see them ever again. And they're spending all their development time working on features designed to like let the user log in, and here's their gallery and a whole portal and all things that are designed to cater to users who come back to the site often and reuse their product over and over again. And they were putting off to the side features that would have maybe helped with converting those users more quickly. So actually forcing people to sign up for your service in order to buy your product is probably getting in the way of users who don't care either way. And maybe you're actually just going to take off at that point because they're sick of going through all the steps that you're forcing them to go through. Tagging your features and understanding how users make use of your tools, your products, your website, it's the only way that you can get that kind of insight. It's the only way you can use that, and you can use that data again to direct like, all right, let's focus on something else now instead. We can gather resource timings. So if you're using code splitting and you're chunking your application into a bunch of different little chunks, you may be curious to know how long do those chunks actually take to load. Good news is, oh, hang on a second. The good news is that actually is something we can get pretty easily. Yeah, so this is tag your features. This is just an example. So we have a thing finder, right? It lives inside our React app. Inside of our onSearch method, we're just going to add a data layer push. We'll have all of our normal code, the stuff that acts just as normal, and then we'll have some code that notifies either Google Tag Manager or Google Analytics, and we'll use that in order to track that behavior, better understand how users are making use of our product. We can use resource timings. So there's a Performance Observer API that you can use in order to keep track of resources the browser loads when it's in the process of loading your site. So that's things like your style sheets, scripts, any resource that's being called out for by the browser. You can track that, and you can set up a listener that basically says every time one of these fires, I'm going to go through each one of the entries that generates, and I'm going to take the timing data from that, and I'm going to log it inside of Google Analytics. And then I can make use of the reporting inside of Google Analytics to visualize and better understand, hey, these are the chunks of my application that are taking too long to load. We need to improve these. How do we improve these? Oh, we're loading all of Lodash in that chunk, and we only need like one little piece. Let's just load just the small piece of Lodash that we need and drop everything else off, whatever it might be. We can measure user speed. So we can see how good is our user's connection, right? Maybe perf doesn't matter, which is like a dangerous thing to say these days, I feel like. But maybe performance actually isn't that important, because maybe 99.99% of our users are on a 4G connection. Maybe they really do have the bandwidth. Maybe we don't have to be so concerned. Alternatively, maybe we've been really underserving users who are on legacy networks who otherwise would be, some of our best. We can track that data just by pulling it out of the navigator object. There's the connection object, and inside of that, you can get downlink, which is going to give an estimate of the download speed, and also the effective type, so 4G, whatever it might be. And this little snippet here, sorry, did somebody say they have a question? Okay, and this little snippet here, what this is doing is it's storing that data in what's called a custom dimension, which allows us to basically extend the default dimensions that we get inside of Google Analytics. We can do error tracking. So real easy, just let's overwrite window on error, and let's use that in order to notify Google Analytics that there's been a JavaScript error, and here's the stack, and here's what went wrong, and then maybe we can go fix it, hopefully sooner rather than later. GTM also has that error listener baked right in. So inside the interface, if we get time, we'll take a look at it, but inside the interface, you can actually just create a trigger for any JavaScript error that happens, and they'll take care of, I kind of left this blank because there's a lot of hoop jumping you have to do to get like the error stack. Like different browsers have different ways of implementing the error event object that gets passed, so you have to do some hinky stuff there. But GTM takes care of all that for you as well, just another bonus. There's also features that allow us to change the way that we define users. So I mentioned earlier, a user that's just a cookie, right? Well, we can change it to be any identifier that we'd like. So if we have a website where our users log in frequently, or a lot of the functionality is behind a login, we can pass in an opaque identifier. That could be a SHA-256 hashed email address, or an ID that we just add as an extra column inside our DB, whatever you want it to be. And we can use that as what our users are grouped by instead of the default cookie. So if I have a user that logs on 80 different devices, so long as they have a consistent email and password, I can track them as one user inside of Google Analytics, get a better idea of how they're using my site across their different devices. Again, it's got to be anonymous. And it only shows up inside of a new view. So it doesn't show up inside the default reports. You have to create a new special set of reports for that. But they behave exactly the same as the other reports, with the addition of some nice cross-device reports that'll show you stuff like, hey, you have a lot of users who maybe do some research on a phone and then come home and buy something from their desktop computer. Right? And there's tons more customizations. This is really just like the bare minimum. But I wanted to spend some time today and talk about what I call spa foot guns. These are basically things that you shoot yourself in the foot with when you're trying to set this up. As it turns out, tools that were designed for the internet as of 2005 have trouble keeping up with the way that the internet works in 2018. And so there's things like, hey, you've installed the snippet on your site, you've got your really nice shiny new React app or Angular app, and you're not getting any page views. You'll see like the home page and nothing else. You're like, what's going on? Why is nothing going on? And the problem is that these tools are designed around the traditional browser server round trip model, right? They're literally, the snippet contains the code that fires that page view, and the expectation is every time a user visits a different page on my website, that code's going to fire again by virtue of the browser's going to request the HTML of the new page from the remote server. That's going to come in. It's going to parse through all that crap, including all my header code, which is where I put the GA snippet. Page view fires. Bob's your uncle. Done. With a single page application, we only have one page load. We load the app, and then all the other page changes inside of the application are handled by the app. That's all handled by the router that ships with whatever our particular stack is using. So in order to fix this, you have to create automagic page views inside of your router. So I work on a project called AngularTix. It's specifically for Angular. I work on the 1. branch. I've kind of looked at the newer Angular 2 to Infinity branch a little bit, but I can't tell you too much about it. But it's really easy to set something up like this, right? In Angular 1, we just have to configure something that we have to configure something on our root scope. We'll grab the route change success event or state change success event if we're using UI router. And then we'll just trigger a page view with that. And we can even go so far as to grab the location service and get whatever the current path Angular thinks our application is on. If we're using React, we might do something like this. With React Router, we might override the existing React Router route and then replace it with this tracked route class, which essentially is just going to extend it. We're going to return the exact same route with the exact same properties, but also whenever that route mounts, we're going to fire a page view. Right? So then we just replace that inside of our routing, and it works exactly the same otherwise. Bonus solution, again, GTM solves for some of these problems. GTM ships with a history change listener, just listens for history change events in the DOM. The DOM actually doesn't emit events when the push state event occurs, one of those. So GTM will polyfill that for you, which is really, really great because it means that we can just set up page view tracking by clicking a couple buttons. We don't have to make changes to our code or overload our router or anything like that. Another problem, often people will set up Google Analytics tracking and they'll be missing their page path data. So this is less of a problem as IE8 has died the slow, fiery death that it's deserved. And so now we don't see this pattern as much anymore, where we're using the fragment in order to handle our routing, and everything just occurs on that one page using the fragment, which of course doesn't trigger a page load or anything. But by default, GA won't include data behind the fragment in the page view path that it gathers whenever a hit goes out. So I mentioned earlier, when we call that page view method, it's just going to grab whatever the current location, path name is, and it'll grab the query string as well, if there's one there. But it won't grab whatever's in the fragment, because it's trying to behave the same way that it would expect a server to behave. Right? Again, models from 2005 maybe don't translate so well to 2018. So instead, we end up with all of our pages being attributed to this thing, right? Instead of being attributed to what we wanted with that full fragment. Really easy fix for that. We just need to configure the hit to send the path that we prefer. So in our gtag call, all we have to do is pass in this third argument, an object, this key page underscore path, and then we can just plug in whatever path we want. So if we're doing that automatically, back here, if we're using our React router, then we'll just use the this.props.path, et cetera, right? And another problem, page titles get goofy, right? Because the page title doesn't change even though the sort of internal title of the state of the application changes. Again, we can configure that manually on our hit. That's just another field inside that object, so we can say, all right, we want this page title to be the home page. I just plugged in like straight strings here, but obviously you'd be using a service or something to get those values and plug those in. A couple GTM specific problems are that often there are things we'd like to do that involve data that's stored in the DOM. So this could be things like when we fire a page view hit, we want to store a custom dimension that has the author of our blog post, right? But if we're using fancy whiz-bang front end in order to render our blog, well, by the time, often our history change event will fire well before the actual changes to the DOM have finished, right? So what will happen is the application stack will say, all right, we have a route change, all right, emit the route change event, and then whatever's subscribed to that, we're going to have that take over and load whatever content it expects there to be. But that event bubbles up, and then GTM captures it, and it fires its page view tag, and we try and get whatever the author's name is, but it actually hasn't been rendered in the DOM yet. So we end up with undefined or null or whatever, right? So we don't have the data that we wanted. And this can be a problem just with any kind of asynchronous interaction because we want to do something after the DOM has changed, right? And the easy fix for this is just let the DOM know that it's changed, right? So let GTM know, hey, after onComponent did mount, we're going to fire this fragment load event, whatever it might be. Again, it takes planning, it takes understanding. You need to talk to the folks who want to measure the thing. They need to talk to you. But once you do that, it's really easy. And then all we have to do is add a tag, a trigger that fires on fragment load, a tag that's associated with that trigger, and then any data we pass along, we can pass that along too, right? One other GTM specific one, so campaign data will get screwed up because of some assumptions being made by single-page applications and some assumptions being made by Google Analytics. So basically, the problem boils down to the way that GA tightly couples itself, its sessionization. No, I'm not going to read that whole thing. That would be insane. But it's really, really niche corner case. It's a huge problem for correct attribution. But the good news is that there's a fix on this blog post here. If you just Google like Dan Wilkerson, Dan Wilkerson GTM single-page applications, you'll probably find the article. And it includes a container file that you can import into Google Tag Manager that will fix this particular issue, as well as get you started with some other stuff, like page view tracking, all that other fun stuff. So you can get going and off to the races. And again, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that you can do. This is a really, really big universe. You can filter data to specific traffic sources, device types, or geographic regions. This can be really important if your reporting only needs to be for one of these things. We only need to see data about organic traffic because that's all we care about. We only need to see data from the United States because that's all we care about, whatever it might be. You can measure literally any behavior on your site or application. As long as you can issue an HTTP request, great, you can measure it. And on that note, the actual underpinnings of those libraries that we're loading are just a simple HTTP API. It's well documented, it's really easy to use. So if you decide you don't want to use the analytics.js library, or you want to do something fancy like, hey, when somebody signs up, there's like a 30-day period between when they sign up and when some important process rolls over, and then we can actually consider them signed up. They have to go through compliance, whatever it might be. Well, as long as you can send a hit that says, hey, here's this user ID from the GA cookie or from what we specified earlier, and this user is now compliant, you can track that data inside GA. So you can say, let's run one report where we see how we got all these users who ended up being compliant and certified, even though it's a 30-day lag in between when they initially sign up and when it actually goes through. Again, you get simple error reporting. You can tie that error reporting to particular browsers, browser versions, and geography. There's over 200 different dimensions and metrics in GA that just ship out of the box with no additional customization that you can use to really enrich the way that you decide how to handle things like these, like bugs. Great example of this. Had an instance where a senior vice president loaded the website, complete white screen, nothing worked. Right? Everyone's panicking. They were going to unshift an entire sprint in order to try and figure out what this particular problem was, solve it. But then we looked at the GA data and we said, hey, turns out he's using this really obscure Android browser that only less than 0.1% of site visitors use. So maybe let's just shelve it and not throw away 2 weeks of work. Right? And that was an instance where we got to use that reporting and use that data in order to be smarter business people. You also get user level reporting. You get tight integration with A/B testing tools. There's a whole nother tool called Optimize, which is designed to do A/B testing simply and easily, multivariate testing, all that fun stuff. Everyone can use it, right? It's not like a lot of the really complicated tools like your Splunk, where you really need to have deep knowledge and understanding about things like SQL queries, things like log files, stuff that would essentially class out entire portions of your organization from being a part of the decision making. GA will solve for a lot of that. But again, none of this awesomeness matters because you can really only get as far as you can get others to care. As you move further up the org chart, jobs become more spiritual, right? You start with the dev, you're just delivering code. You're the project manager, you're delivering a feature. It's an abstract thing, right? You're a CEO, you're delivering something just way removed from the actual reality of what your individual team members are doing, right? Like the CEO of Kellogg's doesn't really talk a lot about cereal, right? He talks more about we're delivering nourishment and family hope and all these things that are just spiritual things. They're bishops standing at their pulpits, right? If you want a better, faster site, you need to convert beliefs. You don't need to convert frameworks. You don't need to convert tools. You need to convert beliefs. You need to proselytize. If you want to affect people, you need to get buy-in because without it, nothing changes, right? And getting buy-in means changing beliefs. And chances are you represent one or more of the ends of those chains of knowledge. You are someone else's belief, right? Someone else is just saying oh, Dan does that. I don't understand anything about it. Dan just does it, right? And I know that it's a website and people order stuff, but after that, it's all Dan, right? You are the end of that chain, which means that you are the thing that they believe in, right? You've already accomplished that goal, and you can change even more beliefs with evidence. You can gather evidence with all the stuff we talked about today, which again can all represent just minor miracles to people who are uninitiated or just haven't considered it. Plenty of times we walk to the boardroom, sit down and talk with somebody and say oh, and you've always wanted to tie the value of the customer lifetime value of these massive contracts that you get with traffic on your website, right? Great, we can do that. And their brains explode out the back of their skulls. They just think this is the most amazing thing in the world, right? But it's important to remember that it is still a belief system. Data can be bad. Analysis can be bad. There's no such thing as objectivity, right? Everything is subjective. We're just trying to guess more better. Go spread the gospel, right? We can all join this cult. Recite our prayer, right? Predict, measure, improve, moisturize. That's a separate thing. Things that work for me in order to both be out there convincing people this is a good thing to do, and also to be humble and understand that like not always right and don't have all the answers. Try and remember that success is analog. It's not binary. It's not you did it well or you did it poorly. It's somewhere in between, right? Acknowledging and challenging the limits of my own beliefs. I'll be the first one to admit it's like, hey, web analytics data can be super powerful, super useful, but there's like this massive world of context that we can't tap into all of the time, right? It can be as simple as like, oh, we've been running television ads. How do those impact traffic to our site? It's like, well, that's, we can do this and that, but there's just some of it that it's just, we don't know, right? We can't solve for that yet. Don't talk down to people, bring them up to your level, right? This is just something that I've found is really, really important to focus on. Examine your own beliefs, slaughter some of your own sacred cows, right? Like ask yourselves about the projects that you've been working on, what you've been trying to do. Why are they important? And are they actually as good and useful and purpose-driven as I think they are? Make some friends, right? And ask some questions. Like right now. Ask questions. Does anyone have any questions? Any questions? Yes.
I had a question on the thing where only 1% of the hits were getting measured.
Yes, the page timings.
What kind of control or do we have over that number or the algorithm, type of sampling algorithm?
Good question. You don't have any control over the sampling algorithm. It's literally just math.random and round it up to 1, right? You can change the rate at which it'll sample all the way up to 100%. So it'll grab timing hits from every single hit that gets sent, but they cap the number of hits that you can collect data on at 1% of your users per day or 10,000 hits, whichever they get to first. So you can send all the hits, but they'll just start throwing them out after you cross a certain threshold.
There's no way to limit it like geographically or browser or anything like that?
You could, but outside of GA. So what you could do is you could say on the front end, we're going to hit like a GeoIP lookup, and if it's in the United States, set it to 100, and otherwise set it to 0. But all that is excess baggage, because the good news is we can actually just use events to gather the exact same data. So we looked at a couple examples of events. They have that category action label. Those can be anything. There are some limits. We can only send 500 bytes for each of those fields, but usually that's plenty, unless you wanted to like track your entire website as a field.
Sampling's only for the hit, the basic hit event then?
The sampling is only for those specific hits, which are called page speed timings. It's just for those. For events and page views, there's some other limits, but they're very, very generous. So there's that 10 million hit limit. There's a 2 hit per second limit, but GA will throttle itself for you, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. GTM kind of circumvents that as well because it'll create a new tracker and take care of some other stuff for you there. There are hit limits per user per day, but those are also quite excessive. It's like 100,000 hits or something. I don't remember the specific number off the top of my head, but it's all documented. Really hard to get to unless you're doing something like we're going to send a hit every 100 milliseconds to get really, really fine-grained time on page data or something like that. So this blog post here, it's just called Increase Your Google Analytics Page Speed Hit Limit. It literally goes from soup to nuts. How do we get the same data that GA is using out of the browser navigation, or the Navigator Performance API? How do we plug that into an event? In this, it's got an example setting that up with GTM and everything. And these won't be sampled. So you can get the same data, you can get the same average, and then if you use the API, the reporting API, you can even pull those distributions as well. So you can get a nice understanding of what the average time on page really actually is instead of the heavily sampled one. Great question. Any other questions? How are we doing on time? I got a feeling we're over. Oh yes, we're about 15 minutes over. All right, is anyone here interested in just watching me go through setting up basic page view tracking inside of Google Tag Manager? You can just set it up in the UI and put it on my presentation. Just show of hands. I just want to know if that's worth the time. Okay, great. What's nice about this little demo is that it takes about 2 minutes to do. So hopefully we can get it done before 8:15 and go have a beer. All right, so we'll make so this is the Google Tag Manager interface. Really nice material design, Google interface. I already have an account set up. obviously. And I just went in here and said, let's create a new container. I don't know the limits off the top of my head. I think they're very permissive again, so I wouldn't. It's not like you get 2 containers or anything like that. Once you create the container, they prompt you with that snippet. We looked at it earlier in the slides. This is the one that normally we would just take this and stick it inside the index.html file or any other resource or sub-resource that's going to be delivered at least once on every page on our site. I'm just going to sneak out the actual script code here because I'm just going to inject this straight through the console. The interface looks like this. I mentioned that they have tags, triggers, and variables. Well, what do you know? Over here on the left-hand navigation, we've got tags, we've got triggers, we've got variables, we've got folders. We don't care about folders, but we do have those. The tag creation process is really, really simple. They've done a really bang-up job with this creation wizard. So I'm going to create a Google Analytics page view tag, and I'm going to tell it to fire on every page view, and I'm going to tell it to fire on every history change event. We're going to do that right now together. Should take less than 60 seconds. So the first thing I do is I go into the interface here and click New Tag. I'm going to name it GA Page View All Pages. Right? Nice and simple. Describes what it does. I mentioned that there's lots of custom vendor tags, so they go outside of Google products. If you're using other like ad tracking tools, other marketing tools, chances are they're here. You can also just inject a big lump of custom HTML. So that includes JavaScript. This could be considered unsafe if you're not careful. But again, now we're back to that trade-offs and proselytizing and everything like that. And I think we had enough of that for today. So we'll select Universal Analytics. That's just the name of their current version of GA. Don't worry too much about it. We have this option here to use a settings variable, so we can reuse settings that we might want to have on all of our GA tags, all of our event tags, all the other stuff that we set up. For now, we're just going to skip that, override it, and then I'm just going to send all the data here to a dummy property. Inside of these More Settings tab, we've got the ability to set basically all the stuff that we've seen, plus way, way more. So I mentioned custom dimensions. We can just set those inside this interface here. Really, really super easy. Other fields to set, which are all things that are specific to configuring, customizing, all can be set up there. We'll skip that for now. And then at the bottom of the tag creation interface, we have to select, all right, when does this fire? When do we actually want this code to execute? By default, we'll have this all pages trigger. This is going to fire anytime the page loads, GTM loads, any tags that this has been assigned to, they'll fire right away. We can also add another trigger inside the interface. And it's super easy to do, even within the tag creation step. We're going to call this history change. We have to choose the type. Like I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of different trigger types that are just out of the box. That's all the way up to like element visibility, scroll tracking, really, really great stuff. YouTube videos, fun stuff like that. JavaScript errors, I mentioned those. But in this case, we just want to fire these page views on a history change event. So we're going to select that guy. We can customize which history change events we want to fire it for, but we're just going to let it be all history changes. And then we're going to click Save. All right, so now we've set up our tag and we've set up our firing triggers. Click Save one more time. Oh, there's one more step that we got to take. So I mentioned that the fragment, we're not going to include that by default, but in this case, we do want to include that. So we're going to change that by using this field to set. We'll set page. Again, these are all stored in here too, so these are all the different configurations that you can set up. There's quite a lot. That's why there's consultancies. But we can change this, and we can actually set this to be a new variable. And we'll have this be the page fragment. I'm going to say that that's all we want. These variables are either mapping to stuff that we push into the data layer. So remember we saw event earlier, and that was set to like page view. I mentioned there's other stuff we could push. We can add that stuff here. We can map it using what's called a data layer variable, which is nice and confusing. Or we can use some of these built-in ones that take care of stuff for us. Really great stuff. We can pick a cookie out if we want to use a cookie. There's also page URL variables that I'm just, there we go, that I'm just trying to pick out here. So we can get one here that's just the fragment for us by default. And these are just wrapping native browser APIs, nice and simple. But again, they're taking some of that pressure away from the dev team, and now it's just something that anybody can do. So I've saved the changes. I've made it so that when it fires, it's going to set the fragment as the page path, and I've made it to, I've set it to fire on all pages, and I've set it to fire on history change events. Now we could just publish it, but we might want to like test it first and just make sure that it works. And so they have this really, really great preview feature. We just click that button there. I already have my page snippet stored in my browser, so I'll just pop open the dev console, and I'm going to run my GTM container. And what the debug mode does is it loads this nice little drawer. We can like move this around. It's really handy. It tells us basically everything that's going on inside GTM's universe. We can see all of the events that it sees as having fired, including this history change event, right? The one that we said that we wanted to fire a page view on. We can see what actually fired, so we can examine, oh hey, it fired a page view. That's what we expected. And we can see the state of variables and something called the data layer, which we mentioned there's that sort of push thing. Not to get too deep in the weeds, but there's a whole other thing that goes along with that. But we can examine the state of that. And then as we change URLs, just by navigating through the presentation, we can see that it's firing those page views on every one of those history change events. And if we jump over to the network tab, we can see them going out as well, or we should be able to. It might be being blocked right now by something. No, it might just be nulling those hits. But normally we'd be able to see those collect requests go out, which are that's just the page view or whatever it is that we're sending. And we can really quickly and easily add additional tracking. So if we want to add an event that fires every time somebody clicks, great, we can do that. I don't know why anyone would want to, but if you really want to go down that route, you can. This is just a question of changing this little drop down at the top. You can say, someone clicked here. Again, we can use those variables to plug in data from someplace else. So we'll plug the page fragment in here just for funsies. We have to configure things like our tracking ID here again. That's why that settings variable is nice, because we can override that, or we can just use that once and have that set everywhere. And we're going to create a new trigger here. We use another one of the built-in ones. And we're going to fire this anytime anyone clicks on anything. Any element all clicks, we'll fire our event. Save that, refresh our preview, jump back over, and voila, as they say. Here is our new version of our container. Now every time somebody clicks, we'll see this GTM click. We'll also see a history change because clicks happen to change change the slide on this particular presentation framework. But well, we get the idea here, and we can see those hits and everything else like that that's supposed to be sending. Maybe we'll get them on the network tab. No, that's okay. All right, so like I said, super easy to get up and running. And again, there are some weird edge case stuff that you have to worry about. Check out that blog post that I mentioned. Download that container. You can import other containers into GTM really simply to extend your current container settings. You can actually they have a standardized export. You can take configurations from one container, import it into another. So the company I work with, Lunametrics, we've got a ton of those that you can use for advanced tracking stuff, get you up and running nice and quick. And yeah, data's great. Google Analytics and GTM, great tools to get that done. I hope you guys have enjoyed the presentation. Thank you for sticking with me. Sorry we went a little bit over time. I think we're going to grab a beer downstairs. That is usually the tradition. So if you want to stick around for that, please do. And otherwise, again, my name is Dan Wilkerson, and thanks so much for spending some time with me tonight.